Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, business, education, anything else that gets our attention. And let me tell you, some things this week got our attention. I guess we should say, we're taping this on a Friday, but we are going to be broadcasting on a Sunday. So it is now daylight savings time for all of you in the future. If you're feeling a little bit bleary this morning, that's why. These days I feel like people might not even notice when it happens because all your clocks kind of automatically reset. So if that's why you're having trouble waking up, or if you're having trouble, that's the reason. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, joined as always by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing, Scott?
Well, I'm kind of bleary-eyed and out of sorts every day. So
right, you might not even notice.
Daylight savings time means nothing to me.
Right. Well, the one good thing for those of us who have school-age kids is that at least it comes at the beginning of spring break, so everybody, including the kids, has a chance to sort of adjust before they have to start getting up for school on the new schedule. But if you are having trouble waking up, we have some things that may help with that and some others that may not. We have an interview coming up this week with Mark Mamontoff, who is a municipal bond attorney, and we're going to be talking to him about the financing details of the new downtown stadium. There was news that came out this week with the final projected actual budget for that. We are going to be getting a bit into the weeds, so for all of you municipal finance junkies out there, good news. We're going to be talking a little bit about a couple of actions taken by the school board this week, following up on some issues that we've talked about before. Some new developments at Ancient Lore Village in South Knox County. Our fantasy-themed resort is getting a little more fantasy-themed. We're going to talk about Knox County's pending ambulance contract. So lots of substantive stuff there. But let's start out. We can't really avoid it. The thing that basically everybody has been talking about for the last few days here in Knoxville and Knox County, in Nashville, in New York, in Washington, D.C., in London. We're talking about Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally. So let's start this out, Scott. Before this past week, tell me what we knew about Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally.
Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally is a pharmacist. He's 79 years old, I believe. He's the longest serving legislator who currently is in the General Assembly. He is the Speaker of the Senate. So he's very, very powerful. He's from Oak Ridge. His district does include parts of Knoxville and Knox County.
Right. We count him as part of our local legislative delegation.
He's kind of a grandfatherly type.
Great grandfather.
He's actually a great grandfather, but you know that kind of grandfatherly type figure. You know, he's not.
And I think sort of legislatively perceived as kind of a steady hand on the tiller kind of guy, not somebody who anybody expects a whole lot of excitement out of, probably. He tends to kind of go along with the Republican Party mainstream. He's been a champion for Governor Bill Lee's major initiatives, and in general is just kind of one of these Nashville stalwarts, right?
Right.
So this week, there's a news outlet, progressive activist news outlet, I guess we should call it, Tennessee Holler, that a lot of people are probably familiar with, run by a guy named Justin Canoe, which breaks a lot of stories. I mean, I think they are kind of on the political activist side, but they do push a lot of things into sort of like the news mainstream. Most recently, before this past week, they had publicized high school photos of Governor Bill Lee in drag at a Powder Puff football game, which got a lot of national attention, not just within Tennessee. This week, they came out with a report which went viral on social media that Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally is on Instagram, which, first of all, I didn't know. I wouldn't necessarily expect him to be on the gram.
I would not expect him to be there either. I could see Facebook. Everybody's on Facebook.
Especially old people like us.
Like us, yeah, we're on Facebook, and I'm on Facebook. I'm not on Instagram. But Instagram is a platform I just wouldn't think would be
right
his
where you would
tea.
find him hanging out. So not only is he on Instagram, but he apparently has an interesting pattern of likes and comments on other people's posts on Instagram. Specifically, there's one account run by a young man who is from Knoxville. I'm not positive he still lives in Knoxville.
Oh, they said he did not anymore.
Did not still live in Knoxville.
They didn't say where he lived, but he said he was originally from Knoxville.
Right. Who is a young gay man who posts a lot of photos of himself that I think your average person would call, maybe kind of provocative, often semi-clothed. I mean, there are limits on Instagram what you can post, so nothing overtly pornographic, but including, like a close-up of his, frankly, admirable posterior. He's in good shape, this fella. And among his followers and frequent commenters and likers on Instagram is Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally, who under several of these fairly provocative-looking photos, and the other thing we should mention, he's not a drag queen, but in a lot of the photos, he is actually in makeup, in lipstick, and so forth.
Yeah, he's fond of the lipstick.
Right.
It's, very bright red.
Yeah, and
unmistakable.
So a lot of these pictures, including that one of his shapely rear end, were liked by Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally, and not just liked, but he would post comments, including often using emojis with hearts, which is kind of like your expression of, I like this, I love this, and also the fire sign, which is often used to really show, like enthusiasm, like, wow, this is great. And so he had a lot of these posts where he was.
Yeah, and the one that was interesting, the photo of the young man's posterior, clad in underwear, but
barely,
but really a close up.
Yeah,
and where he said. See, Finn, you can turn a rainy day into rainbows and sunshine.
Right. This is a comment about somebody's butt.
Yeah, and Finn is the guy's nickname, but I mean, it wasn't just popping through and hitting the a thumbs up or a like button and moving on.
No, he was paying tribute.
Yeah.
So the Tennessee Holler pushed this out, just kind of saying, hey, look at this, basically. And it maybe predictably caught fire. First within the state, and it was Tennessee media first followed up on it. Channel 5 out of Nashville reported on it, and kind of the rest of the media followed suit. We had some, we noted it in our weekday email newsletter. But then within 24 hours, it really went viral. It took off. It has, at this point, and I'm sure we haven't even found all of the places that have picked it up because it's still kind of percolating out there, but it's been covered by, NBC, by Rolling Stone, by CNN, The Independent, which is a British newspaper. You name it. It has really gone nationwide. It's gone international. And, a certain amount of this is just the kind of titillation factor and the incongruity, I guess, of an almost 80-year-old conservative Southern state legislator who is also active on Instagram making these kind of comments. And then, of course, the other major part of this is that Tennessee has also been in the news, national and international, lately, because we have passed yet another passel of, let's just call them anti-LGBTQ bills. Now, the people who support these bills and vote for them always say that they're not anti-LGBTQ bills, that they serve other purposes. In this case, it's to protect children. Other times, it's for other things. But, these are bills that really specifically single out members of the LGBTQ community for particular kinds of restrictions. Right. Most recently, restriction on all ages drag shows and on underage transgender people being able to have access to gender-affirming care. There are other bills still working their way through the legislature, which may or may not pass. The Human Rights Campaign, National Gay Rights Organization, came out after the drag and gender care bills were passed and said that by their calculations, bills that they count as anti-LGBTQ bills, Tennessee is the number one state in the union. Since 2015, we have passed more anti-LGBTQ bills than any other state. I do think that's an important thing for people to know, because sometimes when you're living in a place, you can kind of assume that, well, what's going on here must be going on other places, must be going on at least in Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, our other southern conservative states, and it is. A lot of those states are passing similar bills. We have just passed more. We are the number one anti-gay legislation, anti-trans legislation state in the country. Randy McNally is one of the most powerful people, certainly on paper, in our Republican supermajority, in our Republican-dominated state government. And so there's that added layer of not just, well, this is kind of odd or unusual for somebody in his position to be commenting on these posts, but when you compare it and contrast it with his public record of bills he has supported. He supported all of those bills that we just talked about, voted for every single one of them. It takes on this added dimension of what some people would call hypocrisy, that, you're kind of legislating one thing and appear to be behaving in a way that's at odds with that. So that certainly factored into this story taking off. McNally, to his credit, I would say, because a lot of times when embarrassing things come out about people's online behavior, we hear various kinds of excuses. My account was hacked. Somebody else on my staff must have done that. Those kinds of things. He didn't. He never said that they weren't his likes or comments. And he sat down for an interview with Channel 5 out of Nashville and just kind of said, he said he was sorry if he had embarrassed anybody. And when Phil Williams, the Channel 5 reporter, pressed him on it, he just kind of said, well, I'm just being supportive. I like to support people who, who are out there posting and living their lives, which I'm not sure fully answers the question about what all is going on with these particular posts. But it was a little refreshing for somebody to just say, yeah, I did that. Maybe I shouldn't have.
Yeah. That was, he did own it. That was the one thing that was unusual, really, about this. I mean, usually, you think politicians are probably going to be just, avoid the question. He voluntarily went on Channel 5 in Nashville and talked to Phil Williams, and so he did own it. And that whole idea of this the difference between his public stance and his his comments here. I mean, the Tennessee Holler emphasized that it was in fact they said hey, it's great that he's supportive of this man. It's fantastic that
Right.
he's encouraging him.
Right. On the left, nobody's saying, "Oh, this is gross that he's, liking these posts."
Yeah.
It's people saying, "Well, that's fine, but what about these bills that you support?"
Yeah, but the Holler pointed out that their opinion was, as a progressive outlet, you'd think this, they would really emphasized the hypocrisy that they see in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think it's interesting, if you step back from this a little bit and think about the news that the rest of the world has gotten out of Tennessee in the last few weeks. First of all, these bills, Pat, we had the first in the nation restriction on drag shows. That made big national, international news. Followed immediately on the heels by the picture of Bill Lee in drag at a high school football game. Followed then immediately on the heels by this story about Randy McNally. We are painting an interesting picture of the volunteer state, both for those of us who live here and those outside the state.
Yeah, I've had a couple of moments in the last couple of weeks where I've thought, well, I almost wish I wasn't from Tennessee and I lived somewhere else and I heard about this. What would I think about it? It's just, of course, you can't do that. I mean, you can always talk to somebody from other places to see what their impressions are. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's been everybody involved in tourism in Tennessee and everything else. They want Tennessee to be known for Dolly Parton and country music and the mountains and things like that. But that's not what we're getting the press about.
And not just tourism, but you think about like economic development.
Right,
you think about attracting employers and so forth. There may be some employers who would see this kind of thing and be like, "Oh, that sounds like a place I want to move." There might be a lot of people who would be like, "What exactly is going on down there?
Yeah.
What's happening with those folks?"
I would, in fact, I would say that's probably more the reaction that you would get is just puzzlement.
Yeah. Well, and so kind of in line with this, we also had some coverage this week about the drag bill, because as we've talked about on this show before, the way that bill is written is a little bit ambiguous. It is basically really restricting only overtly sexual drag performances, which, as we've talked about, does not constitute most drag performances and certainly doesn't constitute most all ages drag performances. And it kind of leaves everybody wondering, well, what does this actually do? What's the effect going to be? So we went and talked to whoever we could find to talk about it, to try to figure out the actual effect it's going to have. The ACLU of Tennessee is very clear on this, that pretty much anything that was legal before this bill passed is still legal. They're really emphasizing that it's not, and of course some of the national coverage of that drag bill has been very reductive. We have always tried to specifically explain what it does and what it doesn't do, but you see national headlines that just say Tennessee's banning drag shows. Well, first of all, Tennessee's not banning drag shows. As the ACLU said, Tennessee is not even banning all ages drag shows. You can certainly, if you read the law as it's written, it applies to obscene performances only. You can still have non-obscene drag shows for any age audience. Where the tricky part comes in is figuring out what specifically is somebody going to find obscene. We got some comments from the district attorney's office here and also Knoxville Police Department. And they were, I would say, of course, nobody's going to just come out and say, here's what we're going to enforce or not enforce. The DA's office, of course, is mostly in a reactive position here. They don't get involved until either the Knoxville Police Department or the Sheriff's Office actually arrests somebody for something, right, files charges against them. So their position on it was just kind of, as with
see what happens.
as with anything, if there is an arrest, we will look at it. We will see how state law applies. KPD's response was, well, we're still evaluating the law, but as always, our focus is on public safety, improving quality of life. You read between the lines of their responses, and the impression certainly I got was it's not something that anybody locally is looking to make a big law enforcement priority out of going and,
Yeah.
supervising drag performances.
Yeah, there's one of the things that law enforcement and prosecutors as well include them in law enforcement. I would think that they really don't want to be bothered with this kind of thing, because what they really are after, especially in the city of Knoxville Police Department, they're really focused on violent crime, and this, like we've said before, obscene stage shows have already been actually regulated, but
They're restricted in lots of ways.
in many ways already, and this doesn't put any more restrictions on them, and it just has the potential to be a distraction to law enforcement, and
Right.
But they're not going to come out and say that, even if they think that. I'm not.
Right. They're not going to say, "Oh, we're not going to enforce that
Right,
law."
right.
But it seems a little unlikely that I don't think we're going to have like a drag queen task force formed by the DA's office to go undercover at drag shows, and
I doubt that.
yeah. I mean, of course, if that happens, we will certainly write about it. But okay, well, moving on from that whole interesting realm, we also had some coverage this past week of the Knox County ambulance contract. We have talked about this before. The county is going back out to bid with its ambulance contract for the first time in 10 years. Currently, AMR, American Medical Response, provides emergency service throughout the county, within the city, outside the city. If you need an emergency ambulance, that's who does it under contract with the county. These contracts are not, the county doesn't pay anything for the contract. Basically, the ambulance service has the authority essentially to answer emergency calls, and then they get their money paid by the patients they transport, their insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, whatever.
Yeah, they just get dispatched.
Right.
The county is obligated to dispatch AMR ambulances through 911 calls, essentially.
Exactly. And so AMR has had that contract since 2013, although originally it was actually Rural Metro had the contract, then Rural Metro got bought by AMR, AMR got the contract, then AMR got bought by Global Medical Response, GMR. Lots of private equity money involved in all of this. AMR is now the largest ambulance service in the country. And they have been struggling under the existing contract because it has some built-in penalties if they don't meet certain metrics in terms of having an ambulance on site within a certain number of minutes and so forth. And so the county is looking to write a new contract that kind of reflects the realities that ambulance services across the country are struggling right now because of backups at emergency rooms, because of difficulty in maintaining staffing levels. This is an industry-wide problem. And one of the interesting things for us here locally, AMR has said that they intend to bid on the new contract to retain it, essentially. But we also do have another potential bidder that is based right here in Knox County. Priority Ambulance, which is depending on how you count it, the third or fourth largest ambulance provider in the country, private company. But it is actually headquartered right in Knox County, right off Pellissippi Parkway. And they don't provide emergency service in Knox County right now, but they do a lot of transports like between hospitals and nursing homes and various other kinds of non-emergency services. They do provide emergency service, including right in Loudoun County. They're the primary ambulance provider there, so they do have experience with that. And they are interested in the contract, as you might think they would be, since they are right here, and it might be nice for them to actually have the contract in the county where they're based. But they are kind of waiting to see what the contract looks like and see if they feel like they can put in a competitive bid with AMR. So if you're a subscriber, we wrote a whole long thing looking at the state of the industry right now, what all these trends are, what the pressures are they're under, and then kind of profiling those two companies. There's other companies that could bid, but those are the two most likely contenders.
But we know AMR is going to bid.
Right.
And so that's a given.
Yeah.
And And so, any ambulance company can bid. So.
Yeah. So we'll continue to cover that as that. I think that bid is supposed to be out by sort of late spring or early summer, and then they're expecting to have responses in and award the contract by late summer or early fall. So stay tuned on all of that. But in the meantime, if you want to get caught up on what all is going on there, that story is up on our website.
Yeah, and one thing about the ambulance contract is whenever it comes up, it's a valuable contract for these companies. Knox County may not pay them, but for them, it's very valuable. They fight tooth and nail for it.
Yeah.
They bring out the big guns in PR and do a lot of intense lobbying. And so it's a real when you look at it behind the scenes, it's fascinating as well.
Yep, and that is one thing. Both AMR and Priority are sort of like staffed up on the PR and lobbying front with Mike Cohen, who's an old friend of ours. We've had him on the podcast before. He is the longtime communications contractor for AMR. He's working with them. Priority is working with Moxley Carmichael, and they've also brought in Dean Rice, former chief of staff to former county mayor Tim Burchett, to kind of maybe do a little bit of glad handing around the political circuit. So we don't know for sure that both of them will bid on it, but they are kind of taking the early steps that you would take to get ready for that, and we will see what happens there. Okay, let's talk about Ancient Lore. What is going on at Ancient Lore Village?
They're going to build tree houses there. The Ancient Lore Village, for those who don't know, is an event venue for weddings and corporate retreats and those kinds of things in South Knox County, right outside the city limits, just off Chapman Highway, between Chapman Highway and Sevierville Pike. It is a fantasy theme. We talked about this a little bit last week. It's Tom Boyd, the businessman who is it's his baby. It is kind of very, very Middle Earthish, shall we say?
Right. But not capital M, capital E, Middle Earth, because officially this has nothing to do with The Hobbit or J.R.R. Tolkien.
No, not at all. Anyway, in 2020, he had proposed building a huge resort there, 150 or so overnight units, a full service restaurant that would be open to the public at any time, things like that. It's the property zoned for agricultural use, and he'd have to get it rezoned for commercial use. Well, that did not go over well with the people who live nearby, and they formed a group called Keep the Urban Wilderness Peaceful. And
right, because it's pretty close to where the urban wilderness areas are in
very,
South Knoxville.
Very close, and they fought it tooth and nail, and eventually Tom Boyd just changed plans and decided, okay, I'll make it a rural retreat, which is allowed in agricultural areas, but it's not like a real resort. You can't have a full service restaurant in it. It can't be open to the public. It's got to be, people that or groups that rent it out, exclusively for them. And so that really didn't require it didn't require rezoning. He could already do it, and he got approval to build up to 9 overnight accommodations there. And he built 7, and they're kind of built into the hillside, very whimsical.
Okay. Kind of Hobbit houses, basically.
Hobbit-like. They brought in some real master craftsmen. It's really a well done thing if you're into the whole fantasy thing. But anyway, he built 7 of those, and they've been open for a while. They do events, and then they decided that they wanted to build 7 more units, and they wanted to do them as tree houses. They're not really tree houses. They're actually they're 5 wooden small wooden accommodations on top of these thick pillars that are supposed to, I guess, resemble trees, tree trunks. So there are 5 of those, and then 2 other structures for overnight guests, and which is given the acreage and the zoning, that's the maximum that they could have is 14 on this location. The folks at Keep the Urban Wilderness Peaceful didn't like that idea either.
Right.
They
already don't like the level of activity that's there.
Oh no, that was one of the things. It was very clear. The Planning Commission met last week to decide this, to rule on the Ancient War Village's proposal to double the number of units. And during that, Corinne Ravetti, who's the co-founder of the organization, talked about the noise, especially from construction. She said the construction really hasn't stopped. And noise from construction during the week, noise from events on the weekend. You got music, you've got and lights, and all kinds of, that they're according to her, that they're very intrusive. And the representative from Ancient War Village, Olivia McGee, was there, and she talked about how that they really have been trying to work to keep those things from happening, and that there's one of the neighbors who opposes them goes out in retaliation, blasts music from outdoor speakers on his porch and fires off a gun and every now and then to make noise, which is legal in the county.
Right.
And so there's a lot of there's not a lot of goodwill between the two groups there, but the Planning Commission and Planning staff recommended approval of this. Planning Commission did approve it
because the zoning allows.
The zoning allows it. I mean, it's not like they didn't break any rules for them. They did. Now, as far as there was one issue, they actually wanted. There's a 200-foot buffer that they can't disturb between them and adjacent property owners, and they wanted to build into that 200-foot buffer. And in order to do so, they would have to get signed approval from the property owners. They actually offer the property owners money. I believe it was $1,000 each, and one took them up on it, but the rest didn't. So they really can't encroach in there now. So they're not, and but they did get approval for it. Don't know when construction's going to begin, but they're still the neighbors out there are still very wary of this, and just anticipate that there will be more of an effort in the future to expand the site. One thing is the in the treehouse thing, that was in his original proposal. He wanted tree houses from the beginning. Now he's going to get them, and so that's something that it's one of the usually you hear or you follow these rezoning battles and these planned development battles, and neighbors against the developers and all that, and and it happens. They fight about it. Something gets passed. Usually the developers get something to build. Usually it's everything they want, but then it dies out. You don't. Everybody kind of
adjusts to the new reality.
That hasn't happened here.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that they're still going to get. There's still going to be the neighbors will still be making noise complaints and lighting complaints, and which, by the way, Knox County has said They've gone out there and looked at the lighting. There hasn't been a violation that they've seen. The sheriff's office has sent deputies there in response to complaints. They have said they, didn't find any violations of the noise ordinance. So, which the neighbors are saying is just bull. And so, I mean, it's...
well, and noise ordinances are tricky because a noise ordinance doesn't mean that you can't hear it from your property. Like, it's set at a specific decibel level. And so something can still be quite loud, and especially out in a more rural area, you can hear things for a long way that are not going to violate the noise ordinance.
Well, and some of the neighbors have decibel readers at their property lines and stuff. I mean, they're really... This is not a... this is an all-out, metaphorical all-out war down there. So,
right. What is it in Lord of the Rings? It's like the Battle of the Seven Kingdoms, whatever. All the the humans and the trolls and the orcs and the dwarves and whatever. Well, I guess we'll just kind of continue to see what happens.
One thing about this that was interesting, and they did discuss this some, when they got their approval for this in 2020. The planning commissioners, or some of the planning commissioners, said, okay, we're going to give you this approval, and this plan will work. They actually were approved for 9 units and they only built 7. Said, don't come back. And so here it is 2 years later.
They came back.
3 years later, and they came back. And the neighborhood opposition made a point of that. A couple of the commissioners said, this makes me uncomfortable. Because we did tell them, a lot of these, there's been turnover on the planning commission, but several of them are still there. And, but we told them not to come back, and yet here they are. It wasn't enough to stop the thing. There was only one no vote. And that was Lou Browning as a planning commissioner. His objection, really the only one he stated, really was the project's architect, Dan Levy, wasn't there. He was ill, and he would normally be the one to be there to push it, and he thought that was, they needed to wait for him. But I mean, it wasn't even the ones that were uncomfortable with him, with Ancient Lore Village coming back 3 years later for a different plan or expansion of the plan. Even they voted for it.
Yeah. So. Well, and I think one thing worth mentioning, you mentioned Tom Boyd. He is, among other things, the father of Randy Boyd, owner of the Tennessee Smokies, driving force behind the new downtown stadium, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, and also currently president of the University of Tennessee. And I will say this for the Boyds, when they want to do something... They tend to find a way to do it. I mean, when Ancient Lore Village was first proposed, I saw those initial, the renderings and the kind of like book that went along with it and everything. And to me, it had all the hallmarks of the kind of projects that you see proposed that don't go anywhere. And we've seen plenty of these over the years.
Right.
Somebody kind of comes out with this, fanciful sounding plan. It generates a lot of talk. People, write about it. It gets viral on social media, and then it kind of falls apart. And I kind of thought that might happen here, and that did not happen here. And I think the biggest reason for it is that Tom Boyd really wanted to build Ancient Lore Village.
He really did. When you talk to him, he's real passionate about it. And and you talk to him, and he's very, he talks about the way you think of, someone who loves fantasy literature talks about things. Talks about he wants to be a place of peace and joy and offer anybody who comes. But the one thing, he was also flexible, and he had this big resort planned. When it became very evident that wasn't going to fly, he shifted gears.
Right.
And
he figured out what he could do.
He
went out and built a couple of these houses before it was even clear what was going to happen there.
Yeah, and,
because he was allowed to, do some construction early on.
You can still build on your property. Just depends on how you're going to use it. I mean, he could have built it if everything got rejected. He could have built those and then just rented them out to somebody, to live in. But the that willingness to be flexible. At least for plant in this instance, enabled him to go ahead and build it. And one of the funny things is when I've talked to him, and I talked to him a couple of times after the approval, and I said that, you changed your plans. He said, no, I didn't. I did not change my plans. It's still Ancient Lore Village. It's like, well,
the vision is the same. The vision is what has driven the whole thing.
Yeah. So, so anyway, we have our own slice of a fantasy world down there, and like the Lord of the Rings, it's a lot more violent, not violent, I should say, contentious than it might appear on the surface.
Right. All right. Well, I wanted to give quick updates on just a couple of school-related issues. We've talked before here about the school district's playgrounds policy, and the school district's playgrounds policy is the school district does not build playgrounds. Knox County Schools, for at least the last 30 years, has not included playgrounds as part of their normal programming for elementary schools. And that has left local communities. Our elementary schools do have playgrounds, but all of them have either been built or repaired or renovated, replaced, etc., or almost all of them by local parent-teacher organizations, community groups, and so forth. The school system has kind of treated playgrounds as if they're not part of the educational mission. They're just sort of a separate thing that people can build if they want to. But this has created some issues, including some disparities, because there was a study that came out in December that showed that the schools that have the worst playgrounds and the most outdated equipment in need of repair or replacement are heavily concentrated in the lowest income communities in the county. Not exactly a shock if you think about what's likely to happen when you leave it to local communities to have to pay for. So board member Daniel Watson has been working on this, and he brought a proposal this month that the school board unanimously approved, which is adding playgrounds into the building standards for elementary schools, meaning that going forward, all new elementary schools that are built will have playgrounds built and paid for by the school system, starting with the new Mill Creek Elementary School that's going to open this fall in West Knoxville. And it did not have, like all of the schools that have been built in the last several decades, it did not have a playground included in it, but it will now. That is going to be added into that program. And it still kind of leaves this question out there about, okay, well, what about the existing disparities with the older schools with existing playgrounds? And Watson said that he is still working on that, probably going to be bringing a combination of some outside funding, kind of public-private partnership things. But then he said also, kind of keep an eye on the school budget proposal for next year, that there's likely to be something there. I think the goal, what he would like to see, and I think probably a lot of the board members would like to see, is kind of bring everybody up to where they need to be with, new acceptable playgrounds. And then at that point, have the school system take over responsibility for maintenance and kind of paying for it going forward. But so that is getting, I don't know if solved might be overstating it, but they are taking some steps there. The other thing that happened this week, we've talked about the new charter school proposal. There's been an application put in by a group wanting to open the Knoxville Preparatory School, which would be an all-boys charter school serving grades 6 through 12. They're planning to open in the fall of 2024. They put in their application in the end of January. This past week, the school system's charter review committee, which is mostly made up of members of the administration with a couple of community representatives, but they reviewed the application, kind of went through this whole checklist that the state provides, all the criteria that you have to meet. And it's pretty involved. I mean, that application is 366 pages long. Wow. And, they really have to go into a lot of detail. What's the academic program going to be? What is the facility program going to be? What's the financial plan? All of these things. And basically, the review committee looked at all of those and said, yep, they meet all the criteria. We recommend approval of this. This was not a surprise. This group already operates a very similar school in Chattanooga Prep, also an all-boys school. And so they kind of already know what they're doing. They understand the process of getting a charter school approved. So that recommendation will come to the school board next month, and it will be up to them to give final approval to it. But they're probably going to give final approval to it. Their own review committee kind of said, yes, they meet all the criteria. The way state law is written, local school boards have to have very good specific concerns about an application in order to deny it. Certainly nothing in the charter review meeting that I attended seemed to raise any really substantial concerns.
Yeah, it seems to be one of these things where if you check all those boxes, it has to be approved.
Yeah.
You have to approve. It's very similar to beer permits.
Yeah.
Beer permits that way. If the the applicant for a beer permit checks all the boxes, and a couple of those boxes have to do with criminal records, things like that. But the beer board, whether it's the city or the county, has to approve it.
Right.
They have no choice.
And in both those cases, I think beer and charter schools, those laws are written that way specifically because they don't want these things to be subject to somebody's individual ideological preferences. If the law allows it and you meet the criteria, they want you to be able to do this thing.
But how would you get? How would that work out if you tried to get beer in the charter school?
That, I think, would raise some questions.
You think so?
Yeah.
Okay.
A funny thing about that on the beer permits, do you remember County Commissioner Mark Kaywood?
Yes.
Long time ago, County Commissioner. You probably remember this. I don't know how long he did it for, but certainly for every commission meeting that I was at where a beer permit came up, he voted against every single beer permit that, I think, every single beer permit that was ever brought forward. And he said it was just an ideological thing. He was just against beer. He didn't like it, thought the county should be dry, didn't want it. He totally understood that they actually had to approve this. And if a majority of commissioners had actually voted the way he had, they would have, lost their pants in court over this. But knowing that everybody else was going to vote for it, he just, as a matter of principle, over and over, just voted against all of them.
Gave him the freedom to express his displeasure with beer.
That's right. So it's always possible, one member of the school board, when the charter thing comes next month, could say, I don't like it, I'm voting against it. And that would probably be fine as long as, if the rest of them vote for it, they're not going to have to defend that.
Right.
Okay, well, now we are getting up toward our interview with Mark Mamontoff. But before we get there, Scott, we did have news, fairly big news come out this week about the stadium. So why don't you walk through what we learned this week and kind of set up this conversation with Mark?
Okay, well, we learned exactly what it's going to cost. They finally have come out with the final figures for this. It's a little weird, but the guaranteed maximum price, which is essentially the amount that the public is responsible for, is set at $101 million. And that includes the grant from the state, $65 million bond issue, a $20 million loan from Randy Boyd, the Tennessee Smokies owner. So that will all add up to $101 million. Beyond that, the other $13 million is
because the total budget is actually $114
yeah, it's $114 million. And the other $13 million is coming out of Boyd's pocket, and plus any cost overruns.
Right.
And that's,
so if it turns out to be 120, if it turns out to be 130, whatever, everything else he's responsible for.
If he wants to cut it back and make it not quite as fancy as most new stadiums are, then he's the one who realizes the savings. If he wants to build a palace and throw in all the goodies he can think of, he'll have to pay for it.
Right.
So that is that's that. Now, one thing is a lot of the budget that is covered by his out-of-pocket expenses, he's already done. Like the engineering and design work is already pretty much done. I mean, there's always going to be engineering work throughout the project, but the heavy lifting on that's done. There's some other soft costs that are going to be that they're going to be taking care of that will end up taking up all that $13 million. But yeah, the bottom line is it's 114 million, and if if you're worried about the taxpayer expense, it's guaranteed not to be over 101 million. So.
And I think the estimate is, because there's all these different funding sources, including the TIF district around the stadium. There's the sales tax recapture within the stadium for anything sold within the stadium will go toward it. Tennessee Smokies are going to pay $1 million a year lease on the property. But once you back all that out, it looks like the city and county governments each are going to be responsible for about $800,000 a year in direct contributions, right?
The tax revenue that's going for the bulk of this is new tax revenue generated by the stadium or surrounding development. It's all new stuff. The only part of this that comes out of existing funding, the existing budget, the way it is today, is that they estimate it's going to be about $800,000 each from city and the
What
county.
it really is whatever's left over.
It's whatever's left over.
Yeah.
And now that Mark Mamontoff talks about this in our interview about how that will actually fall over time, and then there's the possibility of things really getting maybe even eliminated because after 10 years they can refinance. If they refinance and the interest rates are lower, then chances are they probably will be.
Right, because they're going to market where the interest rates are kind of elevated.
Yeah, they're at 5 to 5.5% right now. So they're it's and a couple of years ago you could borrow money for nothing, and so anyway so that can help in the long term. But what this means is construction is getting ready to begin. The Sports Authority had already given Alvin Nance, the board chair, the authority to sign the development agreement. That's the big agreement. And once they got the budget numbers and plugged those in, he could sign it. They did it. He can sign it at any time. They did ask him to wait until they could. They wanted the attorneys to put the final document together with the new numbers in it and send it to him. Although they didn't have to.
Right.
But they want to take a look at them one last time. There was no inkling that anyone was going to object to any of it.
And the contractors are ready to go. Denark Construction is down there. They're going to be supervising it.
Yeah, Denark is the primary contractor for it. They bid out a lot of this work. That's why they waited, because they had to bid out the work before they could find out how much it was going to cost. And so they're pretty much ready to go. One of the things is this price has ballooned. A year ago, about a year ago, the estimate was about $80 million. Now it's $119 million.
And the $80 million itself was an increase from sort of 60, 65-ish that was originally talked about.
Yeah, but the huge increase in the last couple of years really has been from materials costs going up and logistics problems and stuff. And one of the things is there's a worldwide concrete shortage, or actually cement shortage. We were at the Sports Authority meeting. Barry Brook, who was from Lawler Wood, and he's kind of the liaison between the board and Denark, the construction team. He's kind of making sure their numbers are all right and good. He said that he's never seen a project with this much concrete. So it happens to be that cement, the main ingredient in concrete, is got a worldwide shortage of it. So I mean, there's a lot of there's been a lot of bad luck associated with the.
The timing is not ideal, but they're going to go ahead and do it.
They are. Now, one thing, you were talking about the contractors, that's was not such good news that came out, is they had a goal of having 17% of the value of the contracts would go to minority or woman or veteran-owned businesses. and they didn't hit that mark. They got it to 15.
So pretty close.
They got it close. But, well, there's a caveat on that. But the main thing is they did, there was a concerted effort through the Knoxville Area Urban League to recruit, and in places where a smaller contractor who hadn't worked on a project like this needed extra expertise, they could get classes and things like some of the business classes especially, because they're a lot like journalists who start their own business. They're good plumbers, but they don't know beans about accounting.
Yeah.
So they did that. One of the problems that happened was the delay from almost a year delay due to these price increases. A lot of these contractors went out and took other jobs. They had to. And plus, Knoxville just doesn't have very many minority contractors.
Right.
And they did expand their scope regionally to try to get contractors to come in, but and they're still going to keep trying to do that. There are contracts that are still outstanding that they're going to, subcontractors will be filling in those. But but they said that they were disappointed. And one of the things I said, there's a caveat on the 15%. About 5% of that is from one company, and it is actually part of the project management team. It's a minority-owned business. And so they were basically saying, well, we don't know if we should count it or not. We're going to count it, and that gets them to 15%.
Right.
So, by some measures, I mean, it depends. If you count that, then they're at 15%. If you don't,
they're at 10.
They're at 10%, which is a lot. It's only 2/3 of the way, or less than 2/3 of the way to their goal.
Right. Well, I do think that it's worth saying that, because both you and I have been out at different points in this to cover some of the outreach efforts that the Urban League made and so forth. There was, I think, what seemed to me like a very sincere and intensive effort to engage people, bring people in, educate them about the project. It did not, to me, feel like just a window dressing exercise. It was pretty intensive.
Yeah, I don't think it was window dressing either. And I think that and one of the things that they emphasized was, we don't want this to be just to get these subcontractors to be able to work on the stadium project. We want them to work, take that experience and what we teach them to go on to other projects in the future and build wealth. And that's the real goal, is to have these small local businesses that are owned by women or minorities or veterans to go and and thrive and increase their wealth. And
build their own capacity, which would also build the capacity of the region to have more.
Yes, and so
DBE contractors.
And we'll see how that ends up working out. I think that I certainly think that they're optimistic that that'll work out. And one other interesting thing about it is this most of that 10% are women-owned contractors. They don't have any veteran-owned contractors, which surprised me.
Yeah, I would have thought, and this is strictly going off of stereotypes, that it might be easier to find veteran-owned construction contractors than women-owned or minority-owned.
Yeah, in fact, I thought that would kind of, if they lump them all together,
right?
Kind of, they were 80% veteran-owned, so
right.
But we hit our target. But no, it wasn't like that at all. They had absolutely none, and which is odd. Now, one thing that the Sports Authority is going to do is they are going to, at a meeting soon, they're going to get a detailed report from DNARC and the team that did this, and on exactly which contracts, how much, what companies, how many employees, those kinds of things that are in this category. So, and that'll be an interesting thing to see there too.
For sure. All right. Well, with all that said, let's go ahead and move to our interview with Mark Mamontoff. And again, we did mention this earlier, but We do get a little bit into the weeds here, so if what you feel like is missing from your weekend so far has been enough discussion of the intricacies of tax increment financing, you're in luck. Let's go to Mark.
Our guest this week is Mark Mamontov. He's an attorney with Bassberry and Sims and bond counsel to the City County Sports Authority, and which means that he has been intimately involved in the putting together the funding package for the new stadium. And one thing I wanted to ask you, Mark. I mean, you've been involved in stadium financing for 3 decades. You've been involved in numerous stadium and arena projects across the state and probably elsewhere. But this project, with the funding, on the funding end of it, we've got a grant, we've got a bond issue, you've got a loan, you've got the owner paying out of pocket. We got all these sources. How unusual is it to have that kind of combination that Knoxville is going to have?
I think it's actually, Scott, not uncommon. However, our stadium is much smaller scale, as you probably have been following. The Titans discussions in Nashville, there's almost a $500 million grant coming from the state there. I would gladly take their $500 million grant instead of our $13.5 million. And I would not even be on here talking to you about financing today. But that's a very complicated financing that includes not only the $500 million from the state, a $720 million bond issue by Metro Sports Authority, 2 different types of collateral, some of them secured by ticket tax, some of them secured by lease payments, similar to what we're looking at. Their list of sources of funds for payment is actually longer than ours. So I would say we are somewhat of a microcosm of Nashville on obviously a smaller scale. Probably closest analog to what we're doing is the Sound Stadium that included some tax increment financing to support its debt service. Not sure they had any state grant money on that one, but there are certainly comparable projects in Nashville. FedEx Forum, AutoZone Park, a little bit the same. Not as much state involvement but often the large number of different sources of payment. The Chattanooga Stadium we're working on right now is they're hoping to be able to pay for it almost exclusively with tax increment revenue from a very large district that surrounds the site of that proposed stadium. So each one's unique, but there's a lot of analogs and parallels between the stadium financing.
Okay, great. Now, one of the things is with the Knoxville project, with the increase in materials costs and inflation, we all know that the price has gone up, and basically, but the public portion, once Randy Boyd offered to loan $20 million for the project, it remains the same. I mean, it's capped at 101 million essentially, and then everything else is going to be on Boyd's shoulders to finance. Another 13 million we know of. Any overruns over that, he would be responsible for. Is it proportionally? Is that common for the team to carry that much of a burden now? I mean, one of the things that people complain about is the public is paying for a private entity to have a place to play.
Scott, it's I think that of course, I'm slightly biased because I've worked on this for 2 years, but I feel like we have negotiated as strong of a deal from a team participation standpoint. I think Chattanooga is negotiating a very strong deal as well. But the Titan Stadium, basically, the Titans are paying a huge chunk of that stadium. They're still getting the largest public subsidy, according to the press, that's ever happened for a stadium, but they're paying a good chunk of it. In our case, it all depends on how you look at it. Certainly, the roughly $12 to $14 million of land costs and demolition costs that he's contributing, plus another 12 to 14 of cold hard cash, as people would say, that he's contributing, is very generous contribution. And I would certainly, Mr. Boyd has been extraordinarily generous. I think, and we're very lucky to have someone who cares about the community as well as cares about his baseball team. But that's a very substantial direct cost out of his pocket: the land acquisition cost, demolition, and and then this just cash contribution. If you count the subordinate TIF, which I know you're familiar with, as an additional contribution, then they're up over $50 million. And then the rent, the present value of the rent, is another 15. So, you could argue that he's roughly, of what he's paying for, is essentially $65 million of the stadium cost through the subordinate TIF, the rent, and his contributions. I've seen reports in the media, not from Knoxville, saying that, that because they see our sports authority bonds and things that we're paying, and the state grant, that we're paying 80-90% of the stadium. I guess I get disappointed that people don't dig a little bit deeper sometimes and look at what's really going on. The subordinate TIF, again, remind for your viewers and readers, is behind a $14 million payment to the city to reimburse them for infrastructure. Will he ever get paid for that? I don't know. I think it's a pretty good bet on his part, but I think we're all super excited to see essentially our own new downtown neighborhood grow around the stadium. But that's what we're all betting on, and he's certainly betting on it. And I'm hopeful for him, but it's quite possible that that amount would never be paid. I'm hope if it's not, then we've all not succeeded. But if it does get paid, then I think we'll all be very pleased that the district created that type of additional property tax revenue.
Well, I want to, at the risk of completely losing our listeners, because I know what happens when you try to talk to people about TIFs, because I've been through many conversations about TIFs, tax increment financing, in this case, a TIF district. But I am curious about the mechanisms of that district. So there's that district surrounding the stadium, and basically new property taxes from new development in that stadium will essentially be dedicated, as you say, first of all, to paying off this $14 million City of Knoxville investment in infrastructure, then to pay back a $20 million loan from Randy Boyd. How does that work? Because that development is going to be incremental over time, presumably. And so I imagine at the early years, that's not going to be generating a whole lot. And then there would presumably be more and more as it goes along. How does that get done on like a year by year basis? Does that money, is it just an annual payment to the city and Boyd, and anything that's not used in one year would roll over to the next? How does that actually work?
Well, Jesse, we are going to lose your listeners with that question, but I'm going to, I have a running joke with one of the local TV stations that I want to feature at 5, on municipal bonds and tax increment financing. And they have consistently turned down my offer because they said that their market share would be adversely affected. So I'm going to dive into ruining your market share. But the state law allows for large developments like this an incremental, what I call triggering. That is not a legal term, but I think it's important for folks here in our community to understand that. So as you have a certain period of time that you get the incremental taxes off a newly redevelopment project. So certainly this is going to be probably a 10-year build out in the area around the stadium. So during that period of time, as each project comes online, we would quote, trigger them such that the tax increment financing, not the financing, but the allocation of tax increment revenues from each project. Because otherwise, if you start the clock today, it certainly would generate some increment from projects that are already, in the works, but it would drastically diminish the value of it. So if you look at the tax increment plan, which again, I know no one would want to do that without being threatened with bodily harm. But if you looked at it, you would see that there's a triggering concept that basically is intended to feather in the tax increment with the likely development over a period of time. And is it a payment? Yes. But this is a redevelopment TIF, not an industrial development board TIF. And one stupid nuance of the law is that a redevelopment TIF, you can only use the increment to pay debt service. So technically the city has to loan its public infrastructure money to KCDC. So they're technically paying back a loan to the city. And the same thing with Mr. Boyd is that they would be paying back a $20 million loan. So it is truly financing. The city chose not to impose an interest rate on their $14 million. Mr. Boyd's is yet to be thing, but it'll be essentially be set based upon a market rate based on the bonds once we hopefully go to market in the next 45 to 60 days.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that will just basically grow over time, and all that money flows into KCDC, and then KCDC allocates each year's returns to the city and then to Boyd.
Right. And I know maybe getting the weeds a little bit, but it's important to know that the city, again, they have $14 million, divide that by 20 years. And so that's $700,000 a year. We'll probably start amortizing that, say, in year 3. And so say they hit $700,000 in a year. After that, then some money would be used to pay the $20 million subordinate TIF. So in other words, the entire $14 million doesn't have to be paid up front. We're just amortizing it $700,000 a year over a 20-year period.
Right. Gotcha.
Okay, Mark. Well, we might end up getting in the weeds a little bit more again. Your baby is the $65 million bond issue. You said it's going to you're going to be going to the bond market in 45 to 60 days. One quick question, probably a yes or no thing: can they go ahead and get started with construction before you get the bond issue?
That's at Mr. Boyd's risk. And so again, thank you. We appreciate that. But yes, all documents, we're not committed to pay anything until we close the bond financing. And so that's to keep us on schedule for a April opening for the team. They basically have to do that to try to keep the project moving.
And one thing about, want to get you to touch on how that's going to be paid back, how the debt service is going to work on the bond issue, because part of this and everything else depends on new tax revenues generated in and around the stadium. This one also involves the city and the county paying a portion out of current revenue streams. So right. I want you to talk a little bit about how the debt service payments each year will be broken down.
Sure. So the team's paying $1 million of rent. There's no offsets for utilities or things. So that's a flat $1 million of rent available to pay debt service. So that will be tied to a separate series of bonds. And I can promise you, if you wanted to talk about tax issues relative to bonds, your market share will plummet immediately. So I am not going to go into that. But the bottom line is that will be a series of bonds that will produce roughly $14 or $15 million based on $1 million a year revenues over the life of the deal. That's a big source of revenue. Then we have sales taxes that are off the stadium. So Scott, when you have your 40th birthday party there at the stadium, when we would appreciate that, and they're going to sell a lot of beer at that party, the sales taxes from that will help pay the debt on the stadium. And that's true of all events, weddings, and everybody wants to get married at home plate, so we're counting on that. I'm using this as a pitch. Oh, that's a bad baseball analogy, but the thing. So all sales tax revenues from the stadium, including the go buy your Smokies T-shirt at the team store. All that will be used and available to pay debt service. CSL, who we hired to estimate the debt service, they interviewed the team, they interviewed the soccer team, they looked at a number of events likely to be held in the stadium. They estimated about $930,000 in the first full year of the stadium from that source, going up roughly 3% a year. I think that's pre 2 years of inflation, as I mentioned at the Sports Authority meeting. So those beers at your birthday party are going to have gone up since the last 2 years. And so, hopefully those are actually low. I personally think we'll knock it out of the park. Sorry for the baseball aphorism, but the first year, because everybody's going to want to see the stadium, and then it'll probably level off a little bit. But that's a huge source of revenues. But it grows every year, and as it grows, just inflation, normal inflation will grow, and as it grows, then the need for the city and county to contribute money will go down, and then the other big source is they're committed to building 2 buildings immediately now adjacent to the stadium. On the left of the stadium, if you're looking from downtown, is the Buford Delaney building, which is where the team offices will be, some other commercial, and the upper floors will be residential condos. That, using TIF and pilot methodology, we will capture 50% of the effectively of the taxes off that building, and 50% of the taxes off the Yardley building, which is on the right side of the stadium, which is apartments and commercial development. That total investment, as I mentioned at the Sports Authority meeting, right now is estimated about $135 million. So our working number on incremental taxes available to pay debt service is $850,000 right now. When I went in front of City Council and County Commission almost a year ago, we were at $750. I feel like certainly $850 is a reasonable number based on inflation and cost and what they now know those buildings will cost. And it probably would be higher, but not too much higher. But I think so you have those 3 main sources of funds to pay debt service, and then the city and the county would split the difference, as we mentioned, probably a little bit over $800,000. Again, depending on where our final pricing comes out, a little over $800,000 each in the first full year. Total estimates, projections. I want to emphasize that, and then declining. Some other big things that could cause that number to go down would be when and if the building across Jackson Avenue that people have been calling Building G, don't know why, because we sort of skipped E and F, but that's where there's been some talk of a grocery store and some other retail and apartments. If that comes online, some of the incremental taxes off of that will also directly support the stadium. And then, as I mentioned at the Sports Authority meeting, when we refinance in 10 years, which we almost certainly will, it likely will lower the debt service about $500,000 a year. And so that gap should drop significantly when we're able to refinance. But unfortunately, the markets are what they are right now. All additional cost of the stadium since we last went in front of County Commission, City Council, is due to interest rate increases, not to, as you said, material cost or things like that. It's purely due to interest rate increases. We are still well within the parameters, though, of the 6% average interest rate that the City Council and County Commission approved. Right now, if we went to market, we probably would have what we call TIC. It's called true interest costs. In plain language, that's more like an average interest rate for the overall financing is probably in the low 5s right now.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question that came up on our subscriber Facebook group this week, which is basically a worst case scenario question. Imagine that the stadium gets built, we get a few years into this, and the baseball team goes away for whatever reason. What happens? So the property is essentially being donated by Boyd Sports. What happens to the property if the baseball team is no longer playing there? There is some restriction on how that property can be used, right?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I think early on that there is going to be a restriction in the deed that says that essentially needs to be used as a sports facility in some manner. That's a great question. It's a fair question from your readers. There's always worst case scenarios, and that would in many people's view, be a serious scenario, a bad worst case scenario. Obviously, we're excited about having minor league baseball back in downtown Knoxville, but it's going to be a beautiful outdoor stadium. I mean, it is okay. I'm biased. I love soccer. My kids all played soccer. We almost certainly would still have the soccer team there. It would need to be adapted. As we've talked to Boyd Sports, oh, I'm so sorry. Hang on one second.
Sure.
Don't know how that came through. Highly, even if they lost the AA franchise, they probably would have an independent team. I don't think there's a great risk of us fully losing a baseball team. But if it did happen, if Boyd Sports went bankrupt and the lease was terminated, it would become a public facility. We would need to make sure we used it for sports events from time to time. But it would become, I hope, the great outdoor venue that our community hopefully will enjoy and need. And I kept making the jokes about having Leonard Skinner there, but I saw the last original Leonard Skinner guy passed away. So I don't know who we're going to have there. Maybe Stevie Nicks will come back after she's done Thompson Bowling. So but I mean, those are the sort of things, again, I hope that we will, they're just a really cool, need for an outdoor venue. And I think this will be a nice one, well located to dining and in our community. So, but yes, financially, would the city and county could have an additional burden, at least for a period of time, if the team goes bankrupt? Yes. I mean, that's clearly the case.
Scott, you have anything else you want to ask, or should we wrap it up there?
We can probably wrap it up. Mark, is there anything else that you think people need to know about the financing of the stadium, the soundness of the plan, anything like that?
No, I think of course, again, readily admit bias. I believe that our plan is sound. I am well aware of the criticisms of sports facilities where you have studies that say it will create millions of dollars of tax revenues and everyone should be happy and think. We have not taken that approach. I think it's important for people to recognize that. We have identified specific new sources of revenue, not hypothetical new sources of revenue that not the rising tide approach that is usually the criticism of these types of things. When interest rates were much lower, those sources of revenue would have covered the debt service within just a few years. Now that rates have increased, yes, we're going to have that larger city and county commitment. But that commitment in the scheme of things is, as I mentioned at the meeting, less, again, everything goes as planned, less than 10% each of the cost of the stadium being paid by the city of county for what I hope, and I'm sure a lot of your readers hope, will be a wonderful public amenity. And it certainly is much less than the cost of the convention center, which, the city and the county, the county supports through hotel motel tax, but the city has supported. And, it's great. We love the convention center, but it did not have the self-supporting revenues other than TDZ revenues, which is a long story to do it. It's a different type of financing, and we've really tried hard to not rely and claim that simply rising tides will, of economic tides justify this. So we're working hard to make this make sense for the taxpayers of Knoxville and Knox County, and we hope everyone will enjoy the facility when it's done.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. We appreciate you stopping by and dragging us into the weeds of financing. So,
yes, it's always great. Thanks for your good work. I must admit, I'm a Compass subscriber and look forward to your reports every morning. So good luck, and we'll look forward to seeing you at Sports Authority meetings.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
See you later, guys. Bye.
Bye.
And thanks again to Mark for talking to us. Mark Mamontoff, I feel like is he's an institution. I mean,
Yes.
I remember having these same kind of interviews with him about the convention center when that was being talked about, like in the late 90s.
Yeah. Mark has been the kind of the public finance guru, not just for our area, but for the in the state. Bassberry and Sims is his law firm, so it's a statewide firm, and the he's been in. I think as we mentioned in the interview, he has been involved in virtually every stadium project and things like convention centers and things like that. For the past 3 decades.
Yeah.
I mean, he's seen it all, and I think that's. He's somebody that if he wasn't from Knoxville, they would still bring him in.
Yeah, for sure.
But they're, I think, and he is very careful about what he says, and he doesn't want to raise expectations or keep them too low. He's a very, he kind of tells it as it is, and one thing, I mean, you're talking about the. People have talked about how big of an investment this is, and it is. It's the biggest one in a while, since the convention center.
Mm-hmm.
But the convention center was huge compared to this.
Yeah.
I mean, it was 160 million then.
Right.
And it's worth. I looked it up
in $2002.
In $2002, it was 160 million. I looked it up the other day, and I wish I'd remembered the exact amount, but I believe it's something like $263 million in today's money. So if you built the convention center today, it would be $260 million.
Right.
Which is a lot
Well,
more.
and it wasn't just the convention center. It was moving a KUB substation.
There were other
and also completely redoing World's Fair Park got done as part of that whole project.
Yeah.
That was for those of you who weren't here when that got done, that was a huge project. And
one thing too is it was a huge project. It costs a lot more than the stadium is, and it doesn't have very little direct revenue out of it.
right.
The revenues that go to paying off the debt, which is still there, is that all that revenue comes from people coming in for conventions.
Right.
It's people. It comes from the hotel motel tax, and so it's not.
Well, and it's also not as we talk about civic furniture sometimes, the sort of amenities that enhance quality of life. A convention center is a normal part of civic furniture, but it's perceived as something you have to have exactly for what you're talking about, to bring people here for a weekend, and it's kind of a calling card. But it's not something that, as a resident, I mean, once or twice a year you might go to an event there, the Home and Garden Show or whatever. But it's not something you just go down on a Saturday and like, hey, let's go to the convention center.
See what's going on.
The stadium will be much more something that will be for, maybe not daily or weekly, but regular use by people who do actually live here.
That's right.
So anyway, and actually one other thing I wanted to mention there, speaking of the convention center, because when you talk to city and county officials about how they're going to pay for their portion of the stadium, one thing that they note is both the city and county are still making annual payments toward that convention center.
Right.
And I think the bonds on that run through 2032. It was a 30-year
Something
bond
like
from
that,
2002. And so by the time they start making these payments on the stadium, be 25, 26, they're only going to be 5 or 6 years off from paying off the bonds on the convention center. The county right now is paying $1.5 million a year toward the convention center. The city's paying more than that, although they have a couple of dedicated funding streams for it. But that cost will go away. And so, like, if you look at Knox County having to put in, yes, it'll be an extra $800,000 a year or whatever that number ends up being toward the stadium, but you get 5 or 6 years into paying off the stadium, that $1.5 million in annual payments on the convention center is just going to disappear from their books.
Yeah, and one thing, the city officials have floated the idea that they might be able to pay off the convention center debt early.
Uh-huh.
Now, I think there's some issues with paying off too early, but they have talked about
that would move up that timeline.
Maybe not 5 years, but a couple of years, early. So,
right.
That's not a done deal. It's just they've floated that idea.
All right. Well, looking ahead to this coming week, as we mentioned earlier, it is spring break for Knox County schools and for the University of Tennessee as well, I believe. And that is a week when most of our civic institutions do not plan public meetings or events because they know that a lot of people are going to be out of town. So we don't have any meetings coming up of city council, county commission, school board. None of them are meeting. There are some bills. The legislature is not taking a week off. So there's some bills continuing to move through there that we will certainly be watching, including bills dealing with the third grade retention law, which we've talked about here before. So we will see what happens with all of that. And then what else are we looking for in this coming week?
Well, one thing is today, Sunday, as this is being first broadcast, is the third anniversary of the arrival of COVID-19. The first case was confirmed on March 12th.
The first local case.
In 2020. And so now we won't...
Happy anniversary, COVID.
Yeah. We won't know the final 3-year numbers until Thursday. Because they report Saturday to Saturday. So so Saturday the 11th was the most recent number we had. So we will have I'm sorry, last Saturday was.
Saturday the 4th is what we have right now. We will have the numbers through this week.
The numbers through the 11th, which is exactly 3 years. We'll have those on Thursday, and hopefully we'll be able, shortly after that, we'll have a report on various aspects of the pandemic and
kind of where we've been, where we are, where we're headed.
That kind of thing. Don't want to be too specific because I haven't written it yet.
Right, we don't have something about COVID.
It'll be something about COVID.
Right. Okay, well, we will be back here next week to talk about those things and anything else that happens. I mean, a week ago, we did not know we were going to be here today talking about Randy McNally's Instagram accounts. Who knows what is going to happen?
It's one of the great things about our business. So,
that's right.
Yeah, because we get all these new things that pop up that we'd never imagined.
You're sitting around thinking, what are we going to write about tomorrow? And then somebody tweets something, and you're like, hold on a second. Stop the presses. All right. Well, thanks as usual to Seth Barber and Barbarian Productions for running this show for us, and our theme music is by Will Wright. Seth, you doing anything for spring break?
Yeah, we're not too exciting. We're just going down to Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, and gonna tour, strap it up a little bit, take kids, hit the indoor water park, probably a buffet or two. That's on my agenda.
I hear they have pancakes there.
There is some pancake places around there.
Yeah.
Which is the weirdest concept to me. Like, I don't understand it. We have one of these right over Scrambled Jakes or whatever right over here. It's like they're busy.
Yeah.
It's like I don't understand a breakfast only restaurant. It doesn't make sense to me.
Pancakes are for any time of day, Seth.
True story.
All right. Well, enjoy that, and we'll see you all back here next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.